from this day to that, for one chance, just one chance, to come back here and tell our enemies that they may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom!
And welcome to Anti-Tyranny News Radio here on UCY.tv. Thank you for joining me this evening. It is Friday, and we are going to cover quite a few different topics today. One dealing with the Ninth Circuit Court and your Second Amendment. Something called pre-search we will go over. I did want to kind of talk about this video that I posted on Anti-Tyrannynews.com's Facebook page. It's pretty interesting. And some good news here in Indiana when it comes to gun license. So we will get into that. Also cover Cuba having been opened up. We'll go ahead and kind of start with that. We've relaxed travel restrictions on Cuba, so you can't go there for tourism, but the loopholes have been officially opened, so even though you may not be going there for tourism, that's what you're doing while you're there. For most, well, I can't even say most people, but for some people, basically there has been loopholes created. So, let me get my mic in front of me a little bit better here. So, now we have Americans flowing into Cuba now. Just recently, we had our first direct flight out of Florida, commercial flight. Before, you'd either have to go through another country or charter something there. It wasn't just, you can go there. No, it wasn't that way. But the thing about it, though, is it's going to be good, but I've also seen talk about how Cuba could potentially become I forget how they were, basically that it would become basically a welfare state of America, which I read the article, I just wasn't quite convinced, but there's a lot of possibilities that could come out of that, but I think there's going to be a lot of positive things that could come out of that. The one thing I fear is that a lot of the money flowing in will be taken by the government, but we're getting that here now, and we have people calling for more free stuff, which comes out of someone's pocket. It's one of those things. I think that there will be more of a benefit for the people there, because if we look at sanctions on a lot of countries that we've had sanctions on, it never really, it may have affected the rulers' life to a certain extent that, now it was a little bit harder to get, cool technology or, cool things, but they were still able to get it where the citizens had trouble getting basic things. So we see how it really does affect countries in a negative way for the people more than it will for the rulers. And, you can see that in Cuba where everybody talks about the old American cars running around Cuba. What they may not realize is a lot of those don't have American motors in them any longer. They tend to have Russian manufactured motors or even, Toyotas in them. But they no longer have the American motors or parts in them. Not all, but, the majority of them don't have the American motor. So if you look at how they make a lot of their parts for the cars, they're basically recycling to be able to keep cars on the road. It's amazing what they can do, but they've been restricted. And I do want to get into this Ron Paul Liberty report. Everything should be hooked up right. And this is traveling to Cuba. And it would be nice to get over there and be able to cover some of, where freedom is able to prosper there, where maybe they have hardships because of any control. But I think there's a very beautiful side to Cuba and the Cuban people. And you don't have to like their government to, have compassion or like the people. And definitely, there's plenty of good people out there. Because, well, how many people like our government? And we see people have so much animosity towards America and Americans, when really, it plays all different ways where, I don't like that country or those people. Why? Because they do this and that. Well, that's their government doing that. Just like we may not like what our government does, it doesn't reflect the people. But let me go ahead and cue this Ron Paul Liberty report up, traveling to Cuba, an idea whose time has come. Now, hopefully this will play.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. Daniel, good to see you.
Hi, Dr. Paul.
Good. Well, we have a good subject today, a very positive story, and I think everybody in America probably heard about it, even though they might have been glued to their TV and listening to the latest speech on immigration and what we should do to build a wall. But we're going to be talking about a wall being torn down. And we're excited about it because it's something you and I have worked together when we were in Washington to try to get to this day. Of course, what I'm talking about is the first flight to Cuba in 55 years. The last time they flew one, I was still in medical school. And so it's been a long time ago that we had a commercial flight. And this went well, and the headlines: historic commercial flight from U.S. lands in Cuba. Another one: Cuba could draw 300,000 visitors from the U.S. this year. And of course, when we were fighting this and trying to get this to happen, there was a lot of resistance into Congress because they said, "Oh, if you do that, that'll make Castro look good." But of course, our position on free trade is obviously clear. The more you trade and talk with people, the less likely we're going to fight with people. So I think you recall the few times that we had to debate this issue. And incrementally, we probably made some progress while we were in Washington.
Yeah, I think it was one of the great stories. You know, when I first came to work for you in 2001, I sort of inherited that from my predecessor, Joe Becker, and working on this. It was really a bipartisan coalition. And I know you worked very hard behind the scenes. You were involved in a lot of these meetings. Jeff Flake was involved, a lot of people on the Democratic side. And through those years, the momentum really built, and it was incredible how much it built. And I think now, while we should definitely credit President Obama for this opening, I think, as you always say, it's an idea whose time has come, and you can't stop it with armies.
No, and I think that is it. When you think of some of the things that have happened in the negative and the positive, when the people, are desperate and want change, they might rally around a bad idea, and bad things happen. But, when you think about the collapse of the Soviet system, that was an idea that had to be eliminated because the time had come where the people didn't support it. And this is what's happening here. I mean, it's just so disheartening, over the years, the American people and American, Cuban Americans who had family back there still would like to send just some simple things that we couldn't conceive of it. Toilet paper and Kleenexes and things like that. They weren't allowed to do this, and all of a sudden things have changed. So I give we criticize them all the time, and Obama deserves a lot of criticism in a lot of the foreign policy, but this is really good that is happening. It reminds me a little bit about the pros and cons of what Nixon did. And Nixon actually did opening with the China a little more secretively than even this. People knew these negotiations were going on, so the opposition was building. So I think it's something that we should be very pleased with, and I think it's going to benefit the Cubans, the Cuban people, and the American people. And, of course, I'm keeping my fingers crossed that we don't have an authoritarian approach to government right now, because I think we can see that the market has already spoken on this. All of a sudden, prices have gone down.
Yeah, it used to be there was a great AP piece that the New York Times carried, and it used to be, of course, you had to jump through innumerable hoops to get it. Then you'd be waiting in line for hours to get a $500 ticket, to go to Cuba. For Cuban Americans who wanted to visit their relatives. But according to the article, this one woman was quoted. She went online for JetBlue for $98. She got a ticket, didn't have to wait at all. She paid $35 for some extra luggage weight. She brought kitchen tiles, a dress, some ice cube trays. Imagine 300,000 people bringing this all the time, and what it's going to do for trade and for relations.
Actually, instead of it hurting the Cuban administration, people are going to feel better. They're going to be wealthier. The country is going to be more helpful. There's going to be more cash inflow, investment in that country, which means they're going to be richer. Yeah. What are they going to do with their riches and the dollars that they get? They're going to spend those dollars in the United States. People say, well, this is just helping the Cubans. They're going to have our dollars. But they're not going to put the dollars in a shoebox. What they're going to do is they will spend these dollars. In one of the things we argued when this issue came up was the farming issue, because we had a lot of rice farmers in the district here that remembered selling a lot of rice to Cuba. It's a short distance away, and it was really a good thing. I think some of the agricultural sales have already occurred, but this should open up the doors to a lot of things. This is not done perfectly yet. Matter of fact, there's one little technicality that is not being for tourists, but the idea is that the door is now open, and the wall has come down. And I think we're going to see positive things if we can just contain the government's temptation to want to take over again. I was kidding, but it's probably serious. I said, now that we've done this, we'll probably force them into NAFTA immediately instead of just letting the companies and the people benefit from a program like this.
It's true that the wall has come down, and the wall was built by both sides. Primarily for us, it's built by our government. But one of the thematic things that we find attractive, the philosophical things we find attractive, is that this sea change has made both governments less relevant in the Cuba-U.S. ties. Now you can go over there. You don't have to have an official government tours. You don't have to have government-guided tours. You don't have the U.S. government hounding you. And so it sort of shrinks the influence of government away from travel between the U.S. and Cuba. That's got to be a good thing.
Yeah. When this was happening, of course, Fidel is still alive in his 90s. I was thinking, I wonder what's going through his head, because it looks like there's a lot of positive excitement there. Anyway, people have to give up the ideas, and times have changed. But when you think back, the Castro movement that occurred in 1959, the takeover, it's not like the good guys were in power. We had and the bad guys, the communists, took over and created this. It was never quite that simple, because that was our hands are not clean with the Batista government, and that was going on off and on, for a couple decades, but especially during the 50s. So from 52, I think, up to 59, Batista was in charge, and he was far from an angel. And this is the whole thing. People, we support governments, and they do things, and they're not good for the people, and then that incites the more radical group. And I think we could argue that's sort of what happens in the Middle East. We support, the Saddam Husseins, and then people disapprove of it. They dislike what we do, and then the radicals who can stir up trouble and say, "Look, this is terrible. This is terrible." I think that's what happened, back in the 50s. When you read about all the things, he was not a civil libertarian. Matter of fact, he was president twice in the early 40s. He was an elected president, and the one thing that he did, that Batista did, was right after Pearl Harbor, he was an ally of the United States. So the next day he declared war along with the United States. But of course, what's Cuba going to do against Japan? But it's interesting that he declared war against Germany, and he had a new constitution, and he was known as a populist who believed in civil liberties. But the second go around, he lost leadership in the late 40s. So when he was sort of cast aside, he says, "Well, I thought I'd be safer if I were in the United States." So he comes to the United States, but I saw him not at that time, but now he was just a CIA guy that we had, and then he went back in the 50s, early 50s. And he got permission to come back. He started a new party, and and they permitted him to run for office. But the election wasn't going well. And, of course, the American government was behind him. It wasn't going well, so he had a military coup. And he takes over the government. Guess who's the very first country to recognize his government? Because it was democratically elected with this democratic coup. The United States immediately supported him, and they did it all through the 50s. And his record for civil libertarians was atrocious.
Yeah. And you mentioned before, by the way, that reminds me so much of Ukraine, doesn't it? You overthrow the government, and that's the. But you mentioned that despite some of his more positive things, that Eisenhower really had a lot to do with the origin of this enmity between the two countries.
Yeah, and it was Eisenhower. It was probably the Dulles brothers.
Yeah.
And, we reviewed the one book, the Kinzer book, about how both Dulleses, really ran. And at the time, most people, I remember Eisenhower so well as a president, and most people said, well, he just sort of doesn't pay attention, and people run things. But that wasn't the case. He was very, very much involved. But, it was a mixed bag. It seems like Eisenhower had this obligation to participate in world events and to protect our interests in the oils and things like that. But he didn't believe in sending troops. He did, I guess, to Lebanon once, but that wasn't his thing. Matter of fact, he was known and most remembered for stopping the fighting in Korea. And I think the interesting about Eisenhower, too, even though he did these things, even like in Iran, and throughout the elected leader Mossadegh, but he opposed and strongly opposed the use of nuclear weapons on that final conclusion of World War II against Japan. Well, he thought it was totally unnecessary, and now honest historians, when they look back, it had nothing to do with ending the war. The war was over by then. So Eisenhower, played a role in it, but we'd like to go that one step further and not endorsing a government that behind the scenes and secretly get involved in coups and CIA operations and elections, and if we don't like the elections, we get rid of them. So it plants bad seeds, and just think of how Cuba suffered over this and how we all suffered over it, and then we had the Bay of Pigs and all these things afterwards.
It goes to show that he could be right about not wanting to invade places. But the problem is the interventionism, whether it's secret or what have you, because as you point out, all the bad seeds that later came, Indonesia, in Latin America, in Iran, all of the things that we're still facing today, were planted by this interventionism. We can turn the dials and control the world.
Yeah, and the historians have shown that during the 50s, when Batista was in power, the real control was really, they called it the American Mafia. And they were individuals that controlled the gambling, the drugs, and the whole works. So it was one of those things, and commercial interest too. So they were very, very powerful. So the big question is on this change is occurring, Are they going to become more libertarian, and are they going to look at this and say free trade and movement is wonderful, and are we going to keep going in that direction, or are we going to say, well, we need more internationalism, and we need them in the IMF, we need to control their finances, we need to have them participating in TSA, we need to put them into NAFTA, and all these things. So there's a lot yet, but still, it's still very, very positive. I think we need the emphasis now on how you keep making progress. And like I mentioned to you, I said, now is the opportunity with hopefully the best export we can send to Cuba is not the concept of Hillary's American exceptionalism, which is American militarism, but American exceptionalism at a time when it used to be freedom and civil liberties and free markets. And I'd like to export a few ideas like Austrian economics. I mean, now that would really be. Today, I'm sure there's still some restrictions on that, and we're in this country having less freedom of speech and speaking out than ever before. But as long as we have opportunity to keep ideas alive, and when the time comes, when an idea whose time has come, the armies can't stop it. The Cuban armies can't stop it. The Russian, Soviet armies couldn't stop the Berlin fall. So that is why we should never give up on promoting our cause. We say, well, we keep losing. They might say, how many times did you vote for this, Ron? Never passed. Yeah. So it was a wasted time. No, but ideas were changing, conditions were changing, and the people finally decided that they wanted something different. So I do truly believe that the government people have is a reflection of the people's attitudes. It's just not instantaneous enough. It's hard to measure. But I think right now we're going through the turmoil in our election because the ideology hasn't quite changed enough people, and there's still a lot of people who are on the entitlement system, both the rich and the poor, and they're not talking about liberty. They're talking about entitlement and power and control and who's going to run the world. And so that's a completely different subject than what I'm talking about because there's no reason why we can't continue to be optimistic in talking about issues and finally seeing some progress.
Yeah, and as you said, it's not perfect. There's still not tourism travel. You have to fit into a few categories to get over there, but that's more a technicality. But, as of December, there will be direct flights from Houston, Los Angeles, New York, Miami, and Fort Lauderdale. So direct flights from Houston. And I was just thinking as I was reading this, we've got our conference coming up here in a couple of weeks or a week or so. maybe we'll be able to do our next conference in Havana. That would be pretty neat, wouldn't
Yeah,
it?
well, now that they can fly out of there, what would be neat too is if a Cuban individual lover of freedom would come to our conference, because they might be interested. But I understand that you even had the opportunity to make a trip to Cuba once, and it was probably a worthwhile experience. And what year was that?
That was 2003, and here's the thing: because you were in Congress and I was a staff member, we were privileged, so we were allowed to travel. Just the Americans who paid our salaries weren't allowed to travel, But it was fascinating, and everyone there wanted to open up to the U.S.
Even the Cuban people that you talked to there.
Absolutely, everyone wanted to. So we're finally getting there.
Well, wonderful. You couldn't just get on an airplane, even though you were part of a government group going there. You couldn't go direct. You had to go through Mexico to get there.
That's right.
Very good. Well, I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report, because we're very pleased to have this, because I think it's a very positive step moving in the direction of the argument, how do you prevent hot wars? You prevent it mostly by more travel, more combination of sales and trade. Trade prevents the wars. And so this is the right direction. But like we said, it's a long way to go to keep the authoritarians from creeping in and taking over once again. But for now, the authoritarians lost. The people who believed in freedom of trade and freedom of movement and a more open society, they have had a victory, and I think it is very positive. I hope it will continue. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report, and please come back soon.
Liberty Report, Ron Paul Liberty Report on YouTube and RonPaulLibertyReport.com. And, again, one thing he pointed out is it's really going to be beneficial for the people of Cuba, and also gives our industries, definitely our automotive and aftermarket industries that have a lot of control now over a lot of the remanufactured parts for a lot of these old cars. There's a benefit on a lot of different sides. So I believe that we would see a lot more good out of this than we will bad. Definitely if we completely open up for free trade and free exchange with Cuba. Now, there's one thing I want to cover. I've seen this out of Forbes and many other places, and people that know me know that I'm really into natural stuff. I don't do pharmaceuticals unless it's antibiotic and it's really needed. I even have natural antibiotics around. But this out of Forbes, which caught my eye, the DEA is placing Crantum and Mitragynine on Schedule 1. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. It's Mitragynyne. The U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency has filed a notice of intent to place a Southeast Asian plant called Crantum on the most restrictive classification of Controlled Substances Act. The plant, Metagyna speciosa, and its two primary constituents, mitragynine and 7-hydromytagyrine, will be temporarily placed onto Schedule 1 on September 30th, according to the filing by the DEA at 8:45 a.m. Eastern Time today. The full announcement is scheduled to be published in the Federal Register tomorrow, August 31st. Various forms of crantum and teas made from the plant's leaves are sold in cafes and on the internet. Their primary effect is to provide a short-lived, peaceful, calm feeling that is described as pleasant, consistent with this effect being opioid, like anecdotal reports indicate that some users have used Crantum to successfully recover from physical and psychological dependence on prescription um, opioids and heroin. Comments on my last report on Crantum have also indicated the successful use of teas made from the plant in managing chronic pain without the side effects and addictive potential of prescription opioids like oxycodone, hydrocodone, and morphine, which those are still going to be okay. Those can be prescribed to you, but this will be put on as Schedule 1, something that doesn't have side effects. Think about that. In the last 2 months, published research has pointed to why Crantum might be useful and safer alternative to prescription opioids. Oh, it might hurt prescriptions. Hey, that might be why. The main component of the herb and alkaloid mitoguanine and its metabolic and oxidation product 7-hydro mitoguanine, I'll pronounce that, produce an effect on the mu subtype of opioid receptors away from many of the mechanisms that cause many opioid side effects. These alkaloids are now shown to be so-called G protein biased ligands, and at the mu opioid receptor, this effect minimizes the engagement of an intracellular protein called beta rustine that, among other effects, cause a reduction in opioid receptors on the surface of cells, leading to the tolerance and dose escalation commonly seen with prescription opioids. The CDC has reported in July that Crantum can be abused and that poison control centers have received over 660 calls between 2010 and 2015 regarding Crantum intoxication. This report has been criticized as being relatively inconsequential given the small number of cases when compared to other legal and illegal intoxicants, in some cases listed as Crantum intoxication. Other illicit drugs were taken by the individuals. The North Carolina state legislature recently described not to restrict and criminalize use and sale of Crantum, limiting it only to buyers over age 18 because of personal testimonials to the benefits of Crantum teas. But the federal intent to place the herb and its bioactive constituents on Schedule 1, the DEA is ignoring the increasing scientific literature on a potential beneficial medical use of the plant. Schedule 1 classification used for drugs with no known medical use and high abuse potential will certainly make subsequent research on the plant more difficult. And it says here that it will keep updating about this. So hopefully we can get that struck down because what we find is some of the things that you see on Schedule 1 that, drugs that tend not to have addictive properties and side effects and have been shown to have medical benefits to them in a lot of research that is ignored, tend to get placed on the highest level of schedule of drug. marijuana. And now this, where other drugs that have high levels of addictiveness, legal and illegal, the legal ones are put on a lower schedule, and the legal ones are allow companies and people to make extreme amounts of money. When a lot of times there's been alternatives shown to be more beneficial, but now it's almost like, in a way, this can be used to try to hide information. If a whole bunch of people find out some plant is beneficial for them, and it's easily spotted, it's easily regulated, or it can't be grown in our climate, they'll restrict it. So you get to a point where you're going, well, why do I want to share this information that I know that this is beneficial? It might get restricted. Of course, that's not going to happen. But it also puts it in a classification that makes it hard for them to research it. That doesn't mean they can't. It just means it's very hard and limited. And who has the resources to do it most of the time would be the big pharmaceutical companies. Well, if it's not addictive, this plant's not addictive, but it would replace the pharmaceutical drug that is highly addictive. Again, that was from Forbes. Go check it out. Now, back to kind of something to do with it. This was out of Reason.com. Ninth Circuit says medical marijuana card holders have no Second Amendment rights. Yes, you heard that right. Yesterday, a federal appeals court ruled that banning gun sales to people who hold medical marijuana cards, whether or not they actually use marijuana, does not violate their Second Amendment rights. In reaching that conclusion, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit relied on an antiquated, scientifically unsupportable assumption about violent tendencies of cannabis consumers. And anybody that's been around marijuana users know that to be wrong. If anything, violent people that start using cannabis tend to become mild people. Which that has been documented and proved. The case Wilson versus Lynch involves a Nevada woman, Rowan Wilson, who in 2011 tried to buy a firearm from a gun shop in Mound House, a tiny town in Lyon County, but was turned away because the owner, Frederick Hauser, knew she had recently obtained a medical marijuana registry card from the State Department of Health and Human Services. Hauser had just received a letter from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and Explosives that said anyone who uses marijuana as medicine, regardless of whether his or her state has passed legislation authorizing medical marijuana use for medical or medicinal purposes, qualifies as an unlawful user of a controlled substance and is therefore forbidden to buy or possess guns under 18 U.S.C. 922. The ATF added that if you are aware that the potential transferee is in possession of a card authorizing the possession and use of marijuana under state law, then you have reasonable cause to believe that the person is an unlawful user of a controlled substance, meaning you may not transfer firearms or ammunition to the person, since violating that edict is a felony punishable up to 10 years in prison. Hauser was understandably reluctant to sell Wilson a gun, which all that is a federal law disobeying state sovereignty, which is part of our law, the law that every other law is supposed to come off of. Thing about medical marijuana, federal government has classified as something. In a lot of these states, the states have nullified that law. And states have nullified federal law when it comes to firearms. Therefore, if it's illegal, they're able to have the marijuana. They're not crossing state lines to buy a gun, which then federal government could step in. They're staying within their state. They have a right to purchase a firearm. Federal government doesn't have to like it, but they haven't amended the Constitution. So guess what? States nullified the medical marijuana. Just like people that take opioids, get prescribed opioids, don't suddenly lose their license or their Second Amendment, or even their driver's license. And they are actually probably more likely to abuse their drug to a point that just because that's how addictive. Again, you just are trying to also classify a herb that has no side effects as a drug, kind of like marijuana. Says here, 2 weeks later, Wilson filed a federal lawsuit arguing, among other things, that the ban on gun sales to illegal drug users in Section 18 USC 922D3, as interpreted by the ATF, violates her constitutional right to keep and bear arms. In 2014, a federal judge rejected that claim, noting that the Ninth Circuit had upheld the federal ban on gun ownership by illegal drug users in the 2011 case, United States versus Dugan. In yesterday's ruling, the Ninth Circuit said Dugan did not dispose of the matter, since Wilson alleges that although she obtained a registry card, she chose not to use medical marijuana for various reasons, such as the difficulties of acquiring medical marijuana in Nevada, as well as a desire to make a political statement. This question posed by Wilson's appeal then was whether it is constitutional to block gun sales to someone who is not an unlawful user of a controlled substance. Hold on, they wouldn't be unlawful because the state nullified it, and they're using, even if they're not using it, let's say they were, they're using it in a state that it is legal just because the federal government doesn't like the fact that the state nullified the federal law. They did. People don't understand that. That's a precedence over it. Now, that doesn't mean that the state can stop the federal government from coming in, but they can. The county sheriff can. The governor can stand in. The state legislators can stand up. And until we start getting people with balls out or willing to do that and uphold people's right, whether you like what they do or not, this person wasn't being a violent person. Definitely marijuana. Are you freaking kidding me? It says she is suspected of being one because she has a medical marijuana card. The appeals court decided that the rule is constitutional based on the same silly pharmacological prejudices reflected in Duggan. The Ninth Circuit Court concedes that the ATF's reading of 18 USC 922 D3 directly burdens Wilson's um, Wilson's core Second Amendment right to possess a firearm, but says the burden is not severe since she could have bought a gun before registering as a medical marijuana patient and could regain her right to buy a gun by surrendering her registry card. The court therefore applies intermediate scrutiny, which requires the government's stated objective to be significant, substantial, or important, and two, a reasonable fit between the challenged regulation and the asserted objective. Since Wilson concedes that the government's interest in preventing gun violence is substantial, the only question is whether a rule preventing people like her from buying guns is a reasonable way of accomplishing that goal. The government argues that empirical data and legislative determination support a strong link between drug use and violence. The Ninth Circuit Court notes, the government did not actually present any of that evidence, but that's okay because studies and surveys relied on in similar cases suggest a significant link between drug use, including marijuana use, and violence, which that has been debunked and shown to be tainted research, basically. People that were using marijuana and drinking and possibly doing other drugs, or had already had a psychological or violence issue where they resorted to smoking marijuana, trying to calm that down, which in a lot of cases they said it did, but if they stopped using it, they became violent. And then they go, well, it's the marijuana. If you stop using marijuana after using it for so long, you become a violent person. Have you ever seen someone quit smoking? Have you ever seen someone quit drinking? Have you ever seen someone come off of an opioid dependency, even though it was legally prescribed to them? But you can read the rest of that article at reason.com. Ninth Circuit Court says medical marijuana cardholders have no Second Amendment rights. All of these articles I've talked about so far on Facebook, Anti-Tyranny News, facebook.com/Anti-Tyranny News. And I had another one here from Reason that really caught my eye. Okay. Pre-search, reason.com, pre-search is coming to U.S. policing. News that the city of Baltimore has been under mass-scale camera surveillance will have ramifications across the criminal justice world when it comes to constitutional criminal procedure, privacy, and Fourth Amendment. It's time to get ready for the concept of pre-search, like the pre-crime police unit in the 2002 movie Minority Report, which predicted who was going to conduct criminal acts. Pre-search uses technology to conduct the better part of a constitutional search before law enforcement knows what it might search for. Since January, police in Baltimore have been testing an aerial surveillance system developed for military use in Iraq. The system records visible activity across an area as wide as 30 square miles for as much as 10 hours at a time. Police can use it to work backward from an event, watching the comings and goings of people and cars to develop leads about who was involved. Google Earth with TiVo capability, says the founder of the company that provides the system to Baltimore. But the technology collects images of everyone and everything from people in their backyards to anyone going from home to work to the psychologist or marriage counselor's office to meeting with lawyers or advocacy groups and to public protests. It's a powerful tool for law enforcement and for privacy invasion. In high-tech Fourth Amendment cases since 2001, the U.S. Supreme Court has stated a goal of preserving the degree of privacy people enjoyed when the Constitution was framed. Toward that end, the court has struck down convictions based on scanning a house with a thermal imager and attaching a GPS device to a suspect's car without a warrant. The Fourth Amendment protects against unreasonable searches and seizures. The straightforward way to administer this law is to determine when there has been a search or seizure, then to decide whether it was reasonable. With just a few exceptions, the hallmark of a reasonable search or seizure is getting a warrant ahead of time. Applying the search concept to persistent aerial surveillance is hard, but that's where pre-search comes in. In an ordinary search, you have in mind what you are looking for, and you go look for it. If your dog has gone missing in the woods, for example, you take your mental snapshot of the dog and you go into the woods comparing that snapshot to what you see and hear. Pre-search reverses the process. It takes a snapshot of everything in the woods so that any searcher can quickly and easily find what they later decide to look for. The pre-search concept is at play in a number of policies beyond aerial surveillance. In Baltimore, departments of motor vehicles across the country are digitally scanning the faces of drivers with the encouragement of the Department of Homeland Security under the Real ID Act. Some DMVs compare the facial scans of applicants to other license holders on the spot. They are searching the faces of all drivers without any suspicion of fraud, and the facial scan databases are available for further searching and sharing with other governmental entities, whether the law enforcement need is felt acutely enough. The National Security Agency's telephone metadata program is an example of pre-seizure. Phone records that telecom companies use to dispose of, having kept them confidential under a privacy policies and federal regulation, are now held so that government can search them should the need arise. Exactly how courts will apply the pre-search concept to mass aerial surveillance remains to be seen. The Fourth Amendment doesn't directly protect our movements in public, but it does protect our persons and houses. Mass aerial surveillance captures data about both. Well, let me put it this way. It's already going on. It's been going on. Think about marijuana grow ops. They fly over people's property all the time. They fly over people's homes. They look in people's other building structures that may be in the backyard using surveillance. I had one person tell me that, yeah, they will do flyovers at night, especially looking for light coming from sheds, and use that as more reason to conduct surveillance on people. It's amazing what techniques they already use, and this being probably some type of drone surveillance won't surprise me. But I think as this keeps getting bigger and bigger, it's starting to aggravate people so much that they're shooting neighbors' drones out of the sky, even though they might not be even over their property or peering on them. Just the neighbor kid flying a drone. There, I read one, I think, on here about, a neighbor shooting a kid's drone out of the sky. It happens. So it's already getting to the point people are getting peed off that they can't be in their fenced-in backyard. If you've seen a Google car, their little street view car that they drive all over all kinds of cities, I remember the first time I seen one. It had a small pole on top with the camera. Last time I seen it, it had a extremely large pole on top of the car. Now with the ability to see over privacy fences. Why? Why is that needed? Why do you need such a large pole? Thing was probably 15, 20 feet off of the car. Why are they doing that? They're doing that for a reason. They didn't just go, we need a bigger pole, see over trucks and stuff. That's not why they did it. I really don't believe that would be why they would do something like that. I really think it does have something to do with being able to give information to government agencies. Because the reason I come to that conclusion is just knowing the connections between government and a lot of these tech companies. Especially Google, which Alphabet Inc. owns Google, which Eric Schmidt and other people from Google have been known to be frequent guests of the White House. So, why shouldn't I think that there's nefarious things? Definitely when we have people in these positions in government and even, some of these tech companies that don't believe you should have privacy. Not from the government and not from people that feel that they're above others and should have the access to this type of information. Hillary Clinton can delete emails. Think if you did that, if you go, here's the emails related to what you want. I deleted everything else, so. What would the prosecutor and the government do to you? If you go, here's what you need, I deleted the rest of it. That's evidence tampering. That is evidence tampering. That's up to the Justice Department. And the whole thing about hand over emails or, any of this. No. You go in and you get those. You get a warrant. You go in. You get the information. It was flawed from the beginning. And I think a lot of us were too happy that she was being investigated to realize that the investigation was flawed from the very beginning. Hand over the emails. Oh, she didn't hand over all the emails they want. She's taking too long. They're going to get her. No. Then he comes out and basically she destroyed evidence. She basically was lying about everything she was telling everybody. But we don't recommend she be charged, even though, she did all this. Even if you destroy potential evidence before they get the warrant to come seize evidence, you can be charged with evidence tampering. Okay. I wanted to cover something that this is really, really fishy. And it kind of has me on edge. And I don't know completely what it's about, but many of you know Homeland Security is to start running the elections. Fishy. Maybe a little bit. What does this mean? Are they finally clamping down on any ability from any type of outsider to disrupt their plans? Because that's what it kind of feels like to me. I'm going to play, this will probably be the last clip I play tonight, another Ron Paul Liberty Report, and this is about the Homeland Security. It's Homeland Security to save us from rigged elections. Do you think that's possible? Or maybe something else helping to rig elections? Let's go ahead and fire this up.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. And Daniel, good to see you.
Good morning, Dr. Paul.
Very good. We're going to talk today about one of your most favorite departments in Washington, the Department of Homeland Security. I understand that they're following up on some of these rumors that they would like to get involved in making sure our elections are not rigged. But you and I remember back in those days, right after, I don't know how many months after 9/11 occurred, but not too long after that, they lined up to change things so far forever from 9/11. But you remember exactly when that bill was coming up, and I'm sure it didn't take us a whole long time to figure it out, but I know you read it in detail.
Well, you know, it started at 20-some pages. Then it went through the House, and it became, I think, something like 200 pages. When it was finally passed, it was almost 600 pages. And it was passed with such quickness that it was impossible for anyone to read it. But they promised us that it would streamline government. This was not adding more deck chairs. No, this was streamlining the government. It's going to make it go more smoothly. You, unfortunately, didn't buy into that, and you had a different view. This is you back in 2002. Rest assured that this new department represents a huge increase in the size and scope of the federal government that will be used mostly to serve, to spy on the American people.
Well, you know, that sounds like a pretty good prediction, but, you know, you don't need a real high IQ to figure that out, because all you have to do is have a little bit of common sense, know a little bit about government, just observe for a short period of time what's happened to our government, and, you know, those are the conclusions that any rational person should come to. But we didn't have too much support from the Republicans. There were just a few of us, and I think we only have one in the Congress now that actually opposed the Department of Homeland Security.
Yeah, Representative Duncan, who's on the board of the Institute.
Yes, so. Right. But, you know, they're in charge of a lot. I can't name all the agencies, but I do know it's everything from the TSA to the Coast Guard. This is a tremendous amount of responsibility they have. But if you want to talk about expansion and control and centralization of government, I think that it's very clear that is what has happened. And I am quite sure that the number of employees that we have for the government since 9/11 is very much greater, and they're very much involved in our personal lives, our personal privacy, overrunning state laws, the whole works. So this next step to take over elections is pretty scary as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, and what they want to do is the Secretary of the Homeland Security Department, Jed Johnson, said he is looking into designating our election process, our voting system, as, quote, critical infrastructure, which would therefore fall under the purview of Homeland Security. And I think they have 16 other areas of critical infrastructure that they're in charge of, roads and bridges and reservoirs and things of that nature. So,
well, usually when they come up with something, even war, they have to have a pretext, and the pretext is pretend. How are we going to deceive the people? How are we going to scare the people? So they're having a pretext for this because there has been talk, and most people think the elections are probably rigged. I certainly think they are because no matter what happens, the same deep state controls everything. So our definition of rigging is different from one to another. But, they got involved a little bit in foreign policy in order to, justify this. And it's always national security. And what is it that they're saying now that is justifying what we're doing?
Well, apparently some voter enrolls in Arizona and Illinois were hacked. That would be the names of the addresses of voters and that sort of thing. So it really technically didn't have anything to do with the outcome. At least in Illinois, they're not even connected to the internet when they vote. So it was data about voters. But immediately they said, it was Russian hackers who did it. Without any evidence, they didn't have any evidence that it was. But as you point out, it gives it this foreign dimension. And as we've seen in the media over the past week or so, certainly the Clinton campaign has bent over backwards to try to convince everyone that Putin's hand is inside the Trump puppet,
Right.
So you put the two together and you think, okay, Putin is going to rig the elections for Trump. Therefore, we got to get Homeland Security involved to save us from the rigging.
Yes, and there's also stories, obviously off the wall, that if an individual, article saying, well, if one of the candidates dies, but the elections could be held up pretty easily. I'm not sure that is in the law, but law doesn't mean anything. So it depends on the chaos. And this goes along with some work that we have done on emergency powers. The president can declare emergency, and he really can take over. This is just more like centralizing those powers into one unit. But the president has ominous powers under declaration, and the Congress doesn't have to vote on that particular thing. They already have. They grant it. If there's a declaration of an emergency, they can do this, and they can, and the president can take over, which obviously is on the books, very scary. And now they're doing this. So I'm not predicting. I haven't been in this position of predicting that before November, the really, really big event is going to happen politically. But that doesn't mean it couldn't happen. And they're always working under the assumption that it could happen, and they're going to solidify this and say, well, the Congress gave us this authority, and now there's an emergency. You don't want to have total chaos. There will be chaos in the streets, and who's going to pass out the orders to our troops overseas? And they'll have all kinds of reasons. So the pretext will be there, and people will be frightened. And unfortunately, I'm afraid too many of them would go along with it.
These kinds of ideas that were just a few years ago considered way out on the fringe now seem pretty mainstream. And with, as you say, the executive branch being granted more power. And of course, there was a lot of power creep toward the executive branch throughout the decades, as you always talked about. But really, it accelerated with 9/11. It really kicked into gear with 9/11. When everyone was so eager to give the president all of this authority.
Yeah. Now, Trump's been talking a little bit about the rigged election, and I believe elections have been rigged, but it's worse than ever. And I think he's correct, but I'm not sure his understanding of the problem and what he thinks should be done is the same. Because my understanding of the rigged election is the elections don't matter. This is a ritual that we go through. And some people say, well, yeah, but you participated. You ran for office. You got in, and maybe you did a little bit of good as an elected official. But I think the big difference is if you go there, that you don't go there to work within the system and believe that you're going to reform it, and all of a sudden you're going to have control of legislation and become a chairman of a committee, and things are going to change. But if a person is involved in the system, I think it has to be for one thing to expose what they're doing. And unfortunately, though, some people think that they can get in and change things. My belief is that the control is the deep state, and people have to realize that. But now that deep state, which seems to be, ushering around the Department of Homeland Security, is manifold. It deals with the media, the military, the medical care system, the whole works, the banking system, and those powers are already there. And I think those individuals who are behind the scenes, who really, find out what the policies are going to be, regardless of who's in office, know exactly what we argue, that this place, our country, and our financial system, the foreign policy, is very precarious, and something terrible is going to happen. So I think the more you hear about this stuff, the more power given to the Department of Homeland Security. They may have false flags, they may do a lot of things, but no matter how an emergency comes up, they're going to make use of it. And the use of it isn't to say, hey, how are we going to protect the American people? Are they worrying when they talk about doing something about rigged elections to make sure the votes are counted? No, they're making sure that the votes aren't counted and they're irrelevant, and the government has all this power, and that they have, in a way, make it a lot easier to hack into our elections. And even the very first, one of the first elections was in 1976. Mm-hmm. We had some fancy machines. I don't think they use them anymore. But people came and explained to me exactly how they can set these machines not to be accurate, and they were sort of primitive. So I'm sure that type of thing is available now. And just think of if that can be done at a local level for an election here and there, it's horrible. But can you think of, centralizing it, turning the whole power over to the Department of Homeland Security for protecting us, and make us safe and secure? And the people say, well, we have to be safe and secure, so therefore they'll protect us.
Yeah, and this point we both noticed that John Whitehead, our old friend, wrote about this, that it's rigged no matter what, and it's such a great point. But as you say, it's the Department of Homeland Security that's doing the deeds of the deep state, and what their goal is to rob us of our liberties and to create a police state. And if you don't mind, if I could just read a short paragraph from Whitehead's latest article, because he points out, okay, we're going to be saved from rigging by the Department of Homeland Security. And he points out, Homeland Security is the agency that militarized the police, spied on activists and veterans, distributed license plate readers and cell phone trackers to law enforcement agencies, contracted to build detention centers, conducted virtual strip searches of airline passengers, established Constitution-free border zones, funded citywide surveillance cameras, and generally turned our republic into a police state. So these are the ones that are going to protect our voting rights.
Right. And the TSA has done such a good job. They're very symbolic of how the American people come to love the TSA. Hopefully that symbol, even though it's a big symbol, will wake up the American people. Why do you want the TSA to run our elections? Essentially is what they're doing. It's the same principle. When we take an oath of office and the president takes anybody that goes to office, swears to uphold the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And I frequently would bring this up at speeches. And those who came to mine always loved it when I would emphasize the foreign and domestic, and this is where the real enemy is right now. Sure, we have to have a national defense, but I don't agitate and read and study and try to change people's mind, because I think that somebody's going to invade us. I want to change foreign policy so that we are less in danger. But really, the greatest danger since 9/11 has been the taking away of our liberties. You know, our civil liberties have been undermined, and actually, I personally date the big picture of the economy, a downturn even prior to 9/11. Since the turn of the century, when we had a stock market bust and the NASDAQ bubble. Mm-hmm. But the 9/11 accelerated that, and it continues. But this will only add fuel to the problems that we have already, whether it's foreign policy. It certainly is going to do nothing to help to protect the civil liberties of the American people. But our big challenge is there are so many people in this country that they think it's the absolute responsibility of government to make us safe and secure and give us a blanket, safety net in order to take care of us, whether it's physically or whether it's from the Russians are coming. Yeah. That is their job, and economically to take care of us. And of course, demanding dependency as a right is what gets us into this mess, and civil liberties become irrelevant. And I'm sure you've heard the arguments, and probably people have called in and you took our calls, and they say, can't Ron understand that you have to give a little bit of liberty in order to be safe? And that's what we need now. We have to be safe. Look at what happened without thinking it through of the reasons why we have become less safe than before. And it's not because the government is too small. It's not because we had overprotection of our civil liberties. It emphasizes the fact that we ought to be concentrating on protecting liberty in this country and understanding just how that comes about, why economic policy is important, and why foreign policy is so important.
Yeah, and just think, back when they were doing the Patriot Act and all this stuff, you were outlining some of the worst case scenarios, and people have called you very alarmist, but that seems very mild compared to what it is. So the whole notion, if I give up a little bit of liberty for my security, if you give up a little bit of liberty, the government's going to come and chomp more and more and more, and that's what's happening.
Yeah, and I think the bigger problem, those people that are eager to vote, and a lot of people vote, and the majority of the American people have some dependency on government. Even those who say, too much government here, too much government here, they still think, well, we have to take, we have to get our share, but they don't want to concentrate on, how corporatism has just defied all concepts of free markets, and how the banking industry and the financial system and the Federal Reserve has co-opted this and provided the privileges and the right to steal from the people, but they're still thinking in a very minor, narrow sense that, I have a right to this, I'm entitled to this. Yes, those guys are bad guys, but just take it away from them instead of changing the system which permitted them to do it. Why are there so many lobbyists, and why are the corporations so powerful? It's because everybody's for sale in Washington. If you had a government that was very, very small for the purpose of protecting liberty, and real government, if you needed any, it would be local, the policemen. Now we have the federal police force is 120,000 people carrying guns to enforce these. And just think, most of those guns are now, under one department. That'd be an interesting number to look. How many people that are under the Department of Homeland Security actually carry guns? And I'll bet you there's a lot. And they're always doing, we're protecting the parks, things like that. Yeah, exactly. So I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report, and I guess you can gather from our little discussion here that we do accept the notion that our elections are rigged, but we certainly don't come down on the side of believing the Department of Homeland Security and TSA will unrig our elections. They're just going to make things much worse, and that is possible, even though some days you wonder, how can they make it worse? But it is a distressing thing to think that probably this is a true statement, that no matter what you do on your vote, whether you vote or not, the deep state is in charge, and that is what we have to deal with. But it is good to be politically active, to preach this message, to show people, exactly what the government's doing to us and why we should be involved. But of course, the whole purpose in the end has to be that we change our economic philosophy. We change our attitude about our protection of our civil liberties, and we change our attitude about getting involved in the internal affairs of other nations, occupying other countries, and being involved in nation building. We do those three little things, and believe me, the world would be much more peaceful, and we would all be much more prosperous. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.
Again, Ron Paul Liberty Report on YouTube. Subscribe, RonPaulLibertyReport.com. Go check them out. And, you know, many people that look at freedom and liberty right now, they look at, you know, it's basically the federal government that they're most afraid of, not another country invading and taking away their freedom. They're afraid of their federal government. When you're using terms like terrorism, we're at war with terrorism. Well, terrorism's a very, 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 most people relate it to, you know, groups that have funding and ideology that they're using to push, but you got to remember how the government works. They'll use a term and redefine it and redefine it and redefine it. They don't even have to do that with terrorism. If you are someone terrorizing a population, well, if you're terrorizing, well, then you're a terrorist, according to them. Now, where do they draw the line on what is terrorizing or not? Now, most people go, well, you know, terrorist, someone that uses fear and force and all that for a political gain. Well, that may be one form, but what about people that do it for maybe not a political ideology, but a religious ideology? Because that's what we are supposedly fighting over in the Middle East, and it's not Muslims or Islam. It's a form. Just like we have people that call themselves Christian that do very unchristian-like things, we have other people in other religions that do the same. And at every point in history, there has always been some religion out there that was using its religion to justify cruel and unusual things being done to people, punishments and punishing people for doing things that really weren't anybody else's business. And that's again where freedom comes in. You know, that's why we need freedom. You were smoking marijuana. I'm going to be the hand of God and strike you. Like, who the hell are you? You know, that's when you look at what politics is, in a way, in today's terms, you know, we have people argue whether America was founded on Christian ideology. There's a lot of proof that it was, and there was a lot of good philosophy that they based off of Christianity and, you know, their beliefs in it. And a lot of founders were anti-slavery, abolitionists that cited the Bible as why slavery was bad. And who's the person that everybody always wants to bring up to put all the founding fathers in a bubble and, you know, a group and say they're all slave owners? They use Thomas Jefferson. Why? Because Thomas Jefferson also had a extremely large, I don't even know how to say it, but he was very charismatic when it came to explaining the idea of freedom. And, he also, at points in his life, addressed the issue of slavery. Um, but many others, there were, I forget which founding father it was, but there was one that had purchased a whole bunch of slaves to do nothing more than free them. There was another one that started a school to teach arithmetic and all the basis of schooling to African Americans. So there is a lot of Christian values and a lot of positive things. I'm not someone that goes around going, I'm a Christian, even though I was raised Christian. I'm more of, spiritual person, not religious person. There's something to say, though, about, some of the things that were in a political view talked about and according to Christian values that, slavery was, these things were discussed and at a high amount. But just like in today's terms, people want to bash them. They didn't believe in freedom. They all had slaves. No, well, Thomas Jefferson, there were a couple other that had slaves, but there were a large amount of them that didn't own slaves. But just like in today's terms, in today's modern life, there are things that are accepted by the majority of society that are not reflective of freedom. Should we expect later generations to look at that and say, they don't know what freedom is? They talked about it, but they didn't do it. To reverse where we are now cannot be instant. The founding fathers also knew that. That's why they didn't jot down in the Constitution, hey, by the way, slavery should be illegal. Because, one, if they wanted to create a state that would be a defender of freedom, they realized that, well, people had to kind of go along with it. You had to get society to go, we like what we hear. But many of them, again, well documented where they believe the country should go. And there's certain things that we have accomplished that the founders wanted to see accomplished. One of them was ending slavery. Even though I always say we didn't end slavery, we just made everyone a slave, except for the elite. We civil rights era didn't succeed in making everybody equal, where it brought, people in poverty up. All it did was bring the majority of people down and succeeded in keeping the elite well fed. Again, manipulation and miseducation. We have to look for ways. That's why, I look at people and go, oh, yeah, I might be a libertarian, but I'm willing to work with the constitutionalists. I'm willing to work with conservative constitutionalist tea parties that really understand freedom, but also understand that we have to take steps to get to that direction. We can't do it instantaneously without some type of violent revolution that more than likely won't end the way we want it to. Someone will still grab control and possibly end up worse than where we are now. I wish we could just flip a switch and go to a free society, but society doesn't know how to handle freedom quite yet. They're been so reliant, we have been for generations. I do have a couple other articles I need to get popped up here on cover. Now, something I've talked about quite a bit in the past few months, probably a little longer than that. This from Dollar Vigilante on Steemit. Brzezinski's ruse: American empire is dead, China and Russia take over. This is something I've been talking about for a long while. Brzezinski has written an article in the American Interest titled "Towards a Global Realignment." That has received a tremendous amount of attention on the internet, along with much gloating. Brzezinski is an architect of the world's current military and economic disasters, and as such, he has plenty of enemies. With this article, they see him recanting his previous arrogance and vision of a worldwide U.S. hegemony. In fact, in the alternative media, many champion his apparent admission as a huge win for the world and a huge defeat for imperialism, but it's not. It's the exact opposite, as I will explain below. Certainly, anyone who cares about humanity and freedom would love to see the American empire die. It has been responsible for uncountable atrocities. And like many, I was surprised at first to learn that one of the world's most evil men was giving up. But I've learned to never take devils like this at the word. Really, now Brzezinski just says he is giving up after a lifetime of building the American empire to the current monstrosity that it is. He's not giving up. All he is doing, all they are doing, the ones who work with him, is moving on to the next level of tyrannical, murderous empire. The next level will be a global empire, a one-world government empire. Brzezinski's statement is just part of a larger strategy of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. In this case, Brzezinski used to provide the thesis as a co-founder of the elite globalist trilateral commission with David Rockefeller. But now he is providing the antithesis. Here from his article. As its era of global dominance ends, the United States needs to take the lead in realigning the global power architecture. 5 basic varieties regarding the emerging redistribution of global political power and the violent political awakening in the Middle East are signaling the coming of a new global realignment. The first of these varieties is the United States is still the world's politically, economically, and militarily most powerful entity, But given the complex geopolitical shifts and regional balances, it is no longer the globally imperial power. This expert um, and others like it in the article have provided celebrations throughout the web. Some of the rejoicing involves the element of sophistication. These analyses begin to understand that so called climb down is not a defeat. But others shout about it from the rooftops. Look, the Americans are going to stop killing everybody. It's over. Russia and China feature strongly in this gloating. In both sophisticated and unsophisticated analyses, the Brzezinski's motive for his climb down is supposedly the threats that these two countries present to U.S. interests. Again, it is difficult to understand how any serious writer with access to the internet can take this interpretation of Russian and Chinese threats seriously. Take note of Putin. Is he really the hero who is going to stop the U.S. empire? Putin's father was supposedly Stalin's chauffeur, um, and Putin came to power under the watchful eye of U.S. and Western bankers who were at the time working hard to establish an independent Russian central bank. Putin was, as well, an assistant to then President Boris Yeltsin and served in various federal capacities in Moscow from 96 to 99. Putin came to Moscow as a deputy chief of the Presidential Property Management Department. By August 99, he had become one of the three first deputy prime ministers. This is an extraordinary rise to power, one so quick that it is tempting to say his rise was preordained. In other words, the 3-year federal career he enjoyed was a kind of formality designed to justify what had already been decided on, that he would be the next leader of Russia, quite similar to Obama's sudden rise to power from a community organizer, whatever that is, to president of the U.S. It is important to emphasize that Putin's rise must have been engineered by Russia's Western U.S. supervisors. I don't believe that. Nothing that took place in Russia at the time would have occurred another way. Putin must have had CIA and city blessing. I don't believe that. When it comes to Chinese, the same sorts of assumptions can be made. There is a good chance, for instance, that China's communist founder Mao was actually a member of Skull and Bones. Mao may have achieved this status by attending a Chinese branch of the Yale Divinity School. Through the U.S. supposedly supported the nationalists when Mao was struggling to take power. A good argument can be made that, as before, Wall Street had already determined that communism would win. Now you can read the rest of the article if you want, steam it, but one thing he points to is Russia and China being a threat, and I really do think they're a threat. Not in, they're going to invade. No, this is a different type of war. I've said this before. This is not a military war. This is a technology and, in a way, our already global environment that we have, where Europe and America aren't the leaders of the world no more when it comes to that. It's going to be Russia and the East that start dictating what's cool, what's trendy. And they're already starting to do that. Look at what a lot of the kids and teens are into, the anime, specifically Asian anime style, and the cosplay and the Pokemon. We weren't paying attention before. But you better start paying attention now. Now, all this stuff ain't Chinese, but the East is starting to dictate what's cool. From the Middle East to the East. And Russia will probably be involved, where Russia will probably be very, very heavily supported by the East, which, if they're starting to be the trendsetters, we already seen all these different concepts that are coming out of Asia, China. We're already seeing all this. And we just kind of been ignoring it. It used to be that our car manufacturers set up factories in other countries. Hondas weren't still made in Japan. They were shipped into the U.S. But we were making vehicles in other countries. We still do. But now we have them putting their factories on our soil. Which is okay. I don't have a problem with that. But you have to look at where the trends are going. Look at where a lot of wealthy Americans go. Dubai, China, Beijing, Hong Kong. We already know that there's a lot of groups in America that do a lot of business with Russia. That Russia is trying to advance their society. I just really believe that we are starting to see the alignment, and we're just not. It's not so in our face. So we're kind of letting it kind of go by unnoticed. I do want to talk about a little positive news here in Indiana, though. And I'm getting this from Wane.com, WANE.com. Title, Number of Active Gun License in Indiana Continues to Grow. Indianapolis AP, the analysis of Indiana State Police data shows the number of state residents who hold active license to carry handguns has grown by nearly 50% since 2012. The Indianapolis Star analysis also shows an increase in the number of Hoosiers who want the option to carry a handgun in public. The state approved more than 50,000 carry permits in the first 3 months of the year. That's more than half of the total number of permits approved in 2015. The number of women holding permits has also skyrocketed. By the first quarter of 2016, more than 174,000 Hoosier women held permits, up nearly 90% from the roughly 92,000 women who held permits in 2012. According to the data, populations in rural areas tend to hold more active permits, while that number falls in urban areas and college towns, which also have a high rate of crime. Yes, you'll notice in the urban and the college areas, there tends to be a lot more criminal activity. A lot of times with criminals with illegal guns. And the city people are always propagandized to fear guns because the criminals are around shooting people, so fear the gun. not get your own. According to the data, populations in rural area. Oh, I already read that part. Morgan County Sheriff Robert Downey said his rural area is low on crime, but carry permits have a public safety utility. We may be 15 to 20 minutes away in the worst case scenario, he said, referencing law enforcement response time. Authorities say applications for permits tend to spike after highly publicized mass shootings and ensuing talk about gun control. Anytime there's an issue in the news where politicians are talking about limiting people's right to bear arms, that proportionally usually results in an increase in people buying license to carry, Indiana State Police Captain Dave Burstein said. But there's no evidence that gun permits deter crime or elevate it, said Gary Kleck, a professor of criminology at Florida State University who studies gun ownership. You're in Indiana. Ask it Indiana professor instead of someone down in Florida. Maybe the Indiana University professor decided not to say something like that. Maybe something to affect that places that have higher gun ownership among law-abiding citizens tend to have less crime. But it says here the news paper analyzed data kept by the Indiana State Police regarding handgun permits. Permit holders and Indiana residents do not need a permit to buy a gun or to carry a rifle, and permits are not required to go target shooting or keep a gun at home. Permits are needed only to carry handguns in public. So, good news that Hoosiers are taking action and exercising their Second Amendment rights. Sucks that you need a permit, but at least we're doing something. Okay. We have about 13 minutes left here. And I'm trying to pull up this other article. Okay, give me a second here. I'm trying to get it popped up here. Okay, sorry. Here's a little bit more good news. This one from Reason.com. New Mexico passed a law ending civil forfeiture. Albuquerque ignored it and now is getting sued. Good for them. Albuquerque resident Arlene Rio 56 is paying off a loan for a car she doesn't have because the city seized it for a crime it readily admits she didn't commit under an asset forfeiture program that is supposed to be banned. After her son was pulled over for drunk driving, Herrero became one of roughly 1,000 people every year who have their car seized by the city of Albuquerque in a process heavily weighted against the property owner. But unlike the vast majority of those cases, she's not rolling over. A new lawsuit filed Wednesday in state court by Herrero and the Institute for Justice, a libertarian-leaning public interest law firm, argues the city's lucrative vehicle seizure program stands in direct contradiction of recently passed state laws and is driven by a premise and unconstitutional profit incentive that deprive Herrero of her 14th Amendment due process rights. It's a scam and a ripoff, Herrero said. They're taking property from people who just loan a vehicle to someone. It's happened a lot. Everybody I've talked to has had it happen to them or somebody they know, and everybody just pays. Republican New Mexico Governor Susan Martinez signed a bill into law last year, essentially ending civil asset forfeiture in the state based largely on critical stories about programs like Albuquerque's. Under civil asset forfeiture laws, law enforcement can seize property without ever convicting or even charging the owner with a crime. New Mexico's reforms require a criminal conviction to seize property. Despite the reforms, Albuquerque has continued to seize cars like Herrero's, arguing the law does not apply to state lawmakers sued the city last year for its refusal to comply with the new law, but their cases were dismissed due to lack of standing. Albuquerque has a particularly aggressive program to seize vehicles from drivers suspected of driving under the influence. According to the Albuquerque Journal, the city has seized 8,369 vehicles and collected more than $8.3 million in forfeiture revenues since 2010, roughly 1,000 cars a year. The cases I've seen are usually where parents own a car, their kid goes out and does something stupid, and then the parents end up getting their car seized. Lisa Taraco, one of the state lawmakers who sued the city, and a practicing attorney told me in an interview earlier this year, which is exactly what happened to Herrero. In April, Herrero's son, Tino, asked to borrow her car to take a midday trip to the gym. When he didn't come back that night, Herrero got worried and started calling around. The next morning, she found out Tino had driven her car to Texas to hang out with his girlfriend. On the way back, he was pulled over and arrested for drunk driving. So I have to pay for a car I don't even have, said Herrero, who works as a customer service representative for Southwest Airlines. It was pretty devastating that it got taken from me. The city soon sent her a notice informing her that it was seizing her car, a 2014 Nissan Versa. Her first thought, she said, was that she still had a $10,000 loan on her car. Herrero decided to challenge the seizure and soon found out that her troubles were just beginning. Vehicle owners in Albuquerque must pay $50 for an administrative hearing plus $10 a day in lot fees for their impounded car. Public defenders aren't available in civil cases, meaning one must choose to pay for a lawyer or attempt to represent oneself, and because the case is civil, the city only needs probable cause a crime was committed, a lower standard of evidence than in criminal proceedings. However, Herrero was held to a higher burden of proof, a preponderance of evidence to prove she could not have reasonably anticipated that the vehicle could be used in the commission of a crime. Faced with the system clearly weighted in the state's favor, many property owners choose to settle. In Herrero's case, the city offered to give her car back in exchange for $4,000 and having it booted for 18 months. Herrero rejected the offer, opting to challenge the seizure at an administrative hearing. This will probably be settled out of court because Albuquerque won't want to challenge the law in court, I believe. That's my personal belief. Faced with the system clearly weighted in the state's favor, many property owners choose to settle. In Herrero's case, the city offered. I read that. At her hearing, Herrero was supposed to have a neutral arbiter, but the chief hearing officer in Albuquerque is Stanley Parada, the same person who crafted the city's asset forfeiture program back when he was city attorney. Parada lectured Herrero, arguing she shouldn't have trusted her son. According to audio of the hearing, Herrero's son had some drunk driving offenses in the past, but the last one occurred in 2009. By providing him with a vehicle, you're taking a big risk, Herrero said. This law is here to try and prevent people from getting killed and injured. Well, if he was convicted and did his time, then and he thought maybe he fixed himself. That might have been her thought. It's guilty until proven innocent. I've already found that out. Herrera was shot back. Herrera said she felt intimidated and harangued by Geronda. Geronda has said in the past that about half of the vehicles that APD seizes are not owned by the vendor that we confiscate from. It's the mothers, the fathers, the wives, the girlfriends, the brothers, the uncles, the next door neighbor, and the stranger on the street. Geronda refused to release the car, and Herrera challenged the seizure in district court, which was the only reason she came onto the Institute for Justice's radar. If Herrera had settled, the money would have gone to pay for the salaries of prosecutors, police who administer the DWI seizure program. Groups like the Institute for Justice argue those sort of perverse incentives are the one of the worst aspects of civil forfeiture, driving police departments to go fishing for seizures. Civil forfeiture is one of the greatest threats to private property in the country today, and the city of Albuquerque is a prime example of how asset forfeiture incentives law enforcement to go after people have done nothing wrong and don't deserve to be punished, said Institute for Justice attorney Robert Johnson. According to last year's lawsuit against the city, Albuquerque forecasts how many vehicles it will not only seize but sell at auction. The city's 2016 budget estimates that it will have 1,200 vehicle seizure hearings, release 350 vehicles under agreements with the property owners, immobilize 600 vehicles, and to sell 625 vehicles at auction. In fact, the Albuquerque City Council approved a $2.5 billion bond to build a bigger parking lot for cars seized under the DWI program. The revenue to pay the bond will come from the DWI program. So that's what you get in Albuquerque. But they're getting sued. But I think they'll settle. Like I said, I think they'll settle out of court. Why do I think Albuquerque will settle out of court? Because this could hamper the majority of their asset forfeiture seizures. It will. Of vehicles, and probably a lot of other cases where the property is not the person that's driving it, someone else. They will have to take those other people to court and prove in court that these people knew or should have had reasonable suspicion to believe that the person they were loaning that vehicle to would use it to commit a crime. But that's kind of hard to prove. Hence why they wouldn't want to have to do that every time. And then have to seize the vehicle after if they can find it. It could be out of their jurisdiction by then. So I'm betting that they will, settle this out of court. Give us $50 and take your car. Leave us alone. Hopefully, the Institute for Justice won't just allow that to happen. They'll probably end up giving it back to her for free without any charges. But I would like to see it go to court and be challenged. I think it should be. We are coming up on the end of the broadcast. I want to thank everybody for tuning in this evening. And stay tuned here on UCY.TV. Great broadcast coming up after this. And don't forget to go to UCY.TV, scroll down to the bottom, click the Amazon button, shop Amazon through UCY.TV, and we get a little kickback to help cover operating costs. And also, My Patriot Supply. Go to antityrannynews.com/MyPatriot. Check out My Patriot Supply, non-GMO seeds, and great prepping gear. And at the same time, Anti-Tyranny News gets a little kickback to cover our operating costs on our end. And I want to thank everybody again for tuning in and supporting UCY and Anti-Tyranny News Radio here on UCY.tv. And stay tuned. Great broadcast coming up after this. And I will be back live this Wednesday. And hopefully I have a short clip for you. I don't know if I'll have it done by then, but I'm trying to work on some small clips. So stay tuned.